In a quaint hillside home in Cedar City, Utah, a 73-year-old retired history professor was about to face the humiliating betrayal from those who claimed to have her best interests at heart. What began as concerned family members suggesting she might need a little extra help took a shocking turn when she discovered they were secretly planning to sell her treasured home and move her into assisted living, all because they claimed her memory was failing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Hayes wasn't your typical septuagenarian. For 42 years, she had molded young minds at Southern Utah University, her encyclopedic knowledge of American history earning her the nickname, the Walking Archive, among colleagues and students alike. When whispers about her mental acuity reached her ears, she realized her lifetime of accumulated wisdom had nearly been dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old woman. The gentle afternoon breeze rustled the pages of the book she'd been reading, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, her namesake and longtime subject of fascination. She adjusted her reading glasses, her hands betraying a slight tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the conversation she'd overheard yesterday. Her son Michael's silver Toyota Highlander navigated the winding driveway with careful precision. The car door slammed shut, and Michael emerged along with his wife, Diane. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the practiced sympathy on their faces, the kind reserved for those deemed fragile and declining. Behind them, a sleek black sedan pulled up, and Eleanor recognized her daughter Sophia, who had flown in from Seattle. This impromptu family reunion wasn't a celebration. It was an intervention, and Eleanor was the unwitting subject. "Mom," Michael had said over the phone 3 days ago, his voice carrying that particular strain that meant he was fighting back emotions he didn't want to acknowledge. "We're concerned about you living alone up there. Just want to come check on things, make sure everything's okay. Nothing to worry about." Eleanor had wanted to say she was fine. The words had formed on her tongue along with all the reasonable assurance. Her daily routine, her book club meetings, her regular volunteering at the Historical Society, the fact that her mind was as sharp as ever. But the desperation beneath his casual tone had made her acquiesce, the way it always did when her children expressed concern. Now, watching them approach her front door with determined expressions, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake in allowing this visit. "Mom," Sophia called through the screen door, her voice overly bright. "We brought lunch from that deli you love downtown." Eleanor opened the door, noting how Sophia's eyes immediately scanned the entryway, likely checking for signs of neglect or confusion. "That's thoughtful, dear. Though I believe you're thinking of Hannah's Deli, which closed 3 years ago. This must be from Paulson's. They opened in the old hardware store building in 2022. A look passed between Sophia and Michael, one of those silent communications that Eleanor had become all too familiar with lately. "Dev Mom got something right, but it must be a fluke. Look. Come in, all of you," Eleanor said, stepping aside. "I've made fresh coffee." They followed her into the kitchen, where Eleanor had already set the table with her grandmother's china, partly because she enjoyed using beautiful things and partly to demonstrate her continuing ability to manage delicate objects. Small rebellions against their assumptions. Michael set down the takeout bags while Diane immediately began rearranging things in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator with the practiced intrusion of someone who felt entitled to inspect another's home. "Mom, when did you last go grocery shopping?" Diane asked, her voice carrying forced casualness. "Tuesday," Eleanor replied promptly. "I drove myself to Smith's. They had a special on Washington cherries. My receipt's on the bulletin board if you'd like to verify." Another look exchanged between her children, this one tinged with something like frustration. Eleanor suppressed a sigh. She'd been a professor long enough to recognize when students were disappointed that she'd caught them unprepared. As they settled around the table, Eleanor noticed a manila folder in Sophia's designer handbag, documents of some kind. Something inside her grew cold at the sight. "So," Eleanor said, pouring coffee with a steady hand, "why don't we dispense with the pretense? You three haven't coordinated your schedules and traveled all this way just to have lunch with your apparently declining mother." The silence that followed confirmed her suspicions. Michael cleared his throat, always the one to take the lead in difficult family matters. "Mom, we've been noticing some things lately that have us concerned," he began, his voice taking on the same tone he used when explaining complex matters to his own children. "Like what, exactly?" Eleanor asked, her academic training kicking in evidence. She needed them to present their evidence. "Well, for one, you forgot Liam's birthday last month," Sophia interjected. "You've never forgotten the grandkids' birthdays before." Eleanor took a careful sip of her coffee. "I didn't forget Liam's birthday. I scheduled his gift to arrive on the actual day. You held his celebration the weekend before due to Jason's Business trip. The package arrived on time, May 17th. Liam called to thank me himself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sophia blinked, momentarily thrown. Well, there was that time you couldn't remember where you parked at the supermarket, Michael continued. That happened once, 7 months ago, Eleanor replied calmly. It was raining, and a kind young man helped me with my umbrella. We got to talking about his history thesis, and I was distracted. It happens to people of all ages. Mom, Diane leaned forward, her voice gentler than the others, which somehow felt more condescending. It's not just isolated incidents. You seem different. Last time we visited, you put the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I set it down while I was putting away dry goods. Then the phone rang. It was the Historical Society asking about the upcoming Civil War exhibit I'm curating. I got caught up in the conversation and forgot about the milk until I returned to the kitchen. A simple distraction, not cognitive decline. The lunch continued in this vein, with her family presenting what they considered evidence of her mental deterioration, and Eleanor systematically dismantling each example with precise recall and logical explanation. She could see their growing frustration, which only strengthened her resolve. Finally, Sophia reached for the manila folder. Mom, we've been doing some research on assisted living communities. There's a lovely one in Salt Lake City, near Michael's family. They have daily activities, medical staff on call, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore. Eleanor felt a surge of indignation. And what makes you think I want to leave my home? The home where I've lived for 40 years? The home where your father and I built our lives together? Mom, be reasonable, Michael said, his patience clearly wearing thin. This house is too much for you to manage alone. The stairs, the yard work, the maintenance, it's a lot for someone your age. Someone my age, Eleanor repeated slowly, the words tasting bitter. I see. And what age might that be when one becomes incapable of managing their own affairs? Is there a specific birthday when autonomy expires? That's not fair, Sophia protested. We're thinking about your safety and well-being. Are you? Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than intended. Or are you thinking about your own convenience? Perhaps about the value of this property and how it might be divided? The shocked expressions on their faces might have been comical under different circumstances. But Eleanor felt no amusement, only a deep disappointment that her children, whom she had raised to think critically and compassionately, had somehow arrived at the conclusion that she was diminished simply because she had grown older. That's a terrible accusation, Michael said, his face flushing. We're trying to help you. By making decisions for me without consulting me? By whispering among yourselves about my supposed decline? By planning to uproot me from my home based on flimsy evidence that I put milk in the wrong place once? Eleanor stood, suddenly needing the physical advantage of height. Help would be asking what I need, not deciding what's best for me. Diane looked uncomfortable, glancing between her husband and Sophia. Maybe we're approaching this wrong, she said quietly. Perhaps we should have started differently. Perhaps you shouldn't have started at all, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I am not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. I am still the same woman who raised you, who taught hundreds of students, who published 3 books and countless articles. My age has changed, but my essence has not. Eleanor walked to the built-in bookshelf that dominated one wall of her dining room, running her fingers along the spines of the books there, many of them her own publications or those of colleagues who had dedicated their work to her. Do you know what the most insidious form of discrimination is? She asked, not expecting an answer. It's the kind that masks itself as concern. The kind that strips away dignity while claiming to protect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dining room floor as silence fell among them. Eleanor could see the conflict on her children's faces, their genuine concern warring with the realization that they had perhaps overstepped. But she also saw something else, something that troubled her deeply. They still weren't convinced. Mom, Sophia finally said, her voice gentler now. We love you. We just want to make sure you're okay. Then ask me if I'm okay, Eleanor replied. Don't assume I'm not based on your preconceptions about aging. The tension in the room was palpable as Eleanor returned to her seat, picking up her coffee cup with deliberate care. The liquid had gone cold, much like the atmosphere around the table. Look, Michael said, attempting a conciliatory tone, maybe we can table this discussion for now. We're here for the weekend. Let's just spend some time together, and we can talk more later. Eleanor nodded, not because she agreed but because she recognized the tactical retreat. Her children thought they were giving her time to come around to their way of thinking. Little did they know, they had given her time to mount her defense. That evening, after her family had retired to their rooms, Michael and Diane in the guest room, Sophia in her old bedroom, Eleanor sat at her desk, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of her life's work. Photo albums, academic journals featuring her articles, letters from former students, awards from historical societies. Physical proof of a mind that had not dimmed with age. She opened her laptop and began to type, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the keyboard. The same fingers that had penned dissertations, graded thousands of papers, and written books that still sat on university shelves across the country. If her children wanted evidence of her cognitive abilities, she would provide it in abundance. By morning, Eleanor had formulated a plan. Not just to prove her competence, but to teach a lesson her children sorely needed to learn. After all, she had been an educator her entire adult life. Teaching was what she did best. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with polite conversation that carefully avoided the topic of Eleanor's future. She could see her children watching her, cataloging her movements, noting how she prepared the meal with efficiency and grace. "I'd like to show you something after breakfast," Eleanor announced as they finished their coffee. "I've been working on a project that I think will interest you." The curiosity on their faces was evident as they followed her to her study, a room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets, its walls decorated with framed photographs and academic certificates. The space radiated intellectual activity, not confusion or decline. Eleanor settled behind her desk, gesturing for her family to take seats on the comfortable leather chairs she kept for visitors, once students seeking guidance, now grown children needing education of a different sort. "You've expressed concern about my memory," Eleanor began, her tone measured and professional, the same voice she had used to command classrooms for decades. "So I thought we might explore that topic together." She turned her computer monitor so they could all see it. On the screen was a PowerPoint presentation titled Memory, Aging, and Autonomy, a Personal Case Study. "Mom, what is this?" Sophia asked, looking confused. "This," Eleanor replied, "is what professors do when their conclusions are challenged. They present evidence." For the next hour, Eleanor guided them through a meticulously researched presentation on cognitive aging, drawing from recent neurological studies, psychological research, and her own detailed records of daily activities. She had charts showing her consistent bill payments, calendars documenting her social engagements, and photographs of the community projects she continued to lead. "As you can see," she concluded, highlighting a particularly compelling graph, "normal aging involves some changes in memory processes, particularly in what's called processing speed. But crystallized intelligence, the accumulated knowledge and wisdom gained throughout life, actually continues to improve with age in many individuals." Her children sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and begrudging admiration. "That's impressive, Mom," Michael finally said. "But preparing a presentation doesn't necessarily mean that I'm capable of managing my daily life?" Eleanor finished for him. "You're right. Which is why I've prepared something else." She opened her desk drawer and withdrew 3 sealed envelopes, handing one to each of them. "Before you open these, I want you to understand something. I recognize that your concern comes from a place of love, however misguided. But love without respect is just another form of control." Her children exchanged uncertain glances before opening their envelopes. Inside each was a handwritten letter, detailing specific memories, private moments between Eleanor and each child that no one else would know. Conversations held in confidence, dreams shared in vulnerable moments, mistakes forgiven in the sacred space between parent and child. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she read about the night before her wedding when she'd confessed her fears to her mother. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he revisited the moment he'd failed his medical school entrance exam and contemplated giving up his dream. Diane looked up in surprise at the detailed account of a private conversation she'd had with Eleanor years ago about her struggles to connect with Michael's family. "These memories," Eleanor said softly, "are the kind that matter. Not where I put my keys or whether I occasionally set something down in the wrong place. These are the memories that shape relationships, that build understanding between people." She leaned forward, her gaze moving between her children's faces. "I remember the important things. I remember who each of you is at your core. I remember your triumphs and struggles. I remember the feel of you in my arms as newborns and the sound of your laughter as children. My memory is full of what matters most." The room fell silent except for Sophia's quiet sniffling. Eleanor continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand aging is frightening, for you watching it happen to someone you love, and for me experiencing it. But we must be careful not to confuse the natural process of growing older with a pathology that needs managing." Michael cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mom, we never meant to suggest you weren't still you. We just worry." "I know," Eleanor acknowledged. But worry can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat me as declining, eventually, I might begin to see myself that way. The research on stereotype threat in aging is quite clear. When older adults are reminded of negative stereotypes about aging before cognitive tests, their performance declines. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Utah landscape. She loved so deeply. The red rocks caught the morning light, glowing like embers against the blue sky. This view had sustained her through grief when her husband passed, through loneliness when her children moved away, through the transition from full-time professor to retiree. This was more than a house, it was the physical embodiment of her independence. I'm not naive, she said, turning back to face them. I know that someday I may need more help. I know that aging brings challenges. But that day is not today, and those challenges are not currently beyond my capacity to manage. Eleanor returned to her desk and opened another drawer, withdrawing a folder of her own. I've had my attorney draw up some documents that I think will give all of us peace of mind. Inside was an advance directive, a durable power of attorney, and a detailed care plan that outlined Eleanor's wishes should her health or cognitive abilities decline in the future. Unlike the documents Sophia had brought, these were created on Eleanor's terms, preserving her autonomy while acknowledging the eventual realities of aging. I'm not opposed to planning for the future, she explained, passing the documents to Michael, who had the most legal experience among them. I'm opposed to having that future decided for me without my input. Michael reviewed the papers, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to respect. This is thorough, Mom. Really thorough. Of course it is, Eleanor replied with a small smile. I was preparing lectures and research papers while you were still learning to tie your shoes. Organization has always been my strong suit. For the first time since they'd arrived, genuine laughter broke the tension. Eleanor watched as her children's shoulders relaxed, as the worry lines around their eyes softened. They weren't fully convinced yet, she could see that, but she had created enough doubt in their assumptions to buy herself time. I have one more thing to show you, Eleanor said, standing again. But for this, we need to go for a drive. The confusion on their faces was evident as they followed her out to her sensible Subaru Outback, a car chosen for its safety features and ability to handle Utah's variable weather conditions. Eleanor took the driver's seat before anyone could protest, adjusting her mirrors with practiced ease. Where are we going? Sophia asked from the back seat, her tone suggesting she was still uneasy about her mother driving. You'll see, Eleanor replied, navigating the winding road down from her hillside home with confidence. She drove through Cedar City with the familiarity of someone who had traversed these streets for decades, pointing out changes in the landscape as they went. That used to be Wilson's Hardware until 1992, she noted, gesturing to a trendy coffee shop. And there, where the community college extension is now, that was once the town's first hospital. Your father was born there in 1947. Eleanor continued her impromptu history lesson as they drove, demonstrating not just her intact memory but her ongoing connection to the community she had helped document and preserve for over 4 decades. She wasn't just reciting facts from the past, she was connecting them to the present, showing an active, engaged mind that continued to build new memories and make new observations. After about 20 minutes, Eleanor turned onto a tree-lined drive leading to an imposing brick building, Southern Utah University, where she had taught for most of her career. Mom, why are we at the university? Michael asked, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. Patience was never your strong suit, Michael, Eleanor remarked with a hint of amusement. Some things don't change with age. She parked in a spot marked, reserved for distinguished faculty emeritus, and led them into the history department building. As they walked the halls, Eleanor was greeted by name by faculty and students alike, many stopping to chat briefly or express delight at seeing her. Professor Hayes, your suggestion for my thesis on Western water rights was brilliant, one young woman exclaimed, clutching a stack of books. The primary sources you directed me to had exactly what I needed. I'm glad to hear it, Jennifer. Eleanor replied warmly. Don't forget about the diaries in the special collections. The settler accounts of the drought of 1896 are particularly relevant to your argument. The young woman nodded enthusiastically before continuing on her way. Eleanor didn't miss the surprised expressions on her children's faces, clear evidence that they hadn't realized how active she still was in academic circles. Eleanor led them to the department's main conference room, where a meeting appeared to be in progress. Through the glass doors, they could see about a dozen people seated around a large table, engaged in animated discussion. What's going on in there? Diane asked, peering through the glass. That, Eleanor said with undisguised pride, is the Cedar City Historical Preservation Committee. We're finalizing plans for the sesquicentennial celebration next year. A rather significant event that I've been helping to coordinate for the past 18 months. She checked her watch, an elegant timepiece that had been a retirement gift from her department. And they're expecting me right about now. Before her children could respond, Eleanor opened the door and was greeted by a chorus of welcomes. The committee chair, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, stood immediately. Eleanor. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the living history exhibits, and we need your expertise on the timeline of local industrial development. Eleanor turned to her family with a smile that managed to be both warm and triumphant. I'll need to join this meeting for about an hour. Feel free to explore campus. The new art exhibition in the Braithwaite Gallery is quite remarkable. Or you might enjoy the coffee shop in the student center. We can meet there afterward. The stunned expressions on their faces as she closed the door behind her gave Eleanor a satisfaction she hadn't felt in quite some time. Through the glass, she watched them stand awkwardly for a moment before slowly walking away, glancing back as if they'd encountered a version of their mother they hadn't known existed. The meeting proceeded with Eleanor taking an active role, demonstrating her encyclopedic knowledge of local history without notes or references. She cited dates, connected historical events to current community structures, and suggested innovative ways to engage younger generations in the celebration. Her colleagues treated her with the respect accorded to a valued expert, deferring to her judgment on several key decisions. When the meeting concluded, Eleanor found her family waiting in the student center as suggested. They sat in uncomfortable silence, the reality of their misconceptions clearly sinking in. Eleanor ordered a complex espresso drink with the confidence of a regular patron and joined them at their table. "How was your meeting?" Sophia asked, her tone markedly different from the condescending concern of the previous day. "Productive," Eleanor replied. "We've finalized most of the major elements for next year's celebration. I'm particularly pleased with the educational components. We're creating an interactive timeline that will be installed permanently in the new city museum." She sipped her coffee, noting the way her children exchanged glances, no longer the conspiratorial looks of those planning an intervention, but the uncertain glances of people reassessing their assumptions. "Mom," Michael finally said, his voice subdued. "I think we may have misjudged the situation." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing her son to find his way to the apology she knew was coming. "We saw a few isolated incidents and jumped to conclusions," he continued. "It's clear that you're not just managing, you're thriving." "Yes," Eleanor agreed simply. "I am." "Why didn't you tell us about all this?" Sophia asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass the university, the committee meeting, the obvious respect Eleanor commanded. "About your ongoing work here?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I suppose because I didn't think I needed to justify my competence. I didn't realize my occasional forgetfulness, the kind that happens to people of all ages, was being catalogued as evidence of decline." The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed her suspicion. They had indeed been keeping mental notes, building a case against her continued independence. "I'm sorry," Diane said suddenly, surprising everyone. As the in-law, she often stayed on the periphery of family disagreements. "I think we've been unfair to you, Eleanor. And perhaps a little arrogant in assuming we knew what was best." Eleanor appreciated Diane's directness, something she had always valued in her daughter-in-law. "Thank you, Diane. Apology accepted." She turned her gaze to Michael and Sophia, waiting. "I'm sorry too, Mom," Sophia said, her eyes downcast. I think maybe we were projecting our own fears about aging onto you." Michael nodded, looking genuinely contrite. "We were wrong, and I'm sorry. The way we approached this was disrespectful." Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders release slightly. This was progress, though she suspected the battle wasn't entirely won. "I accept your apologies. But I'd like you to understand something important: aging isn't a disease. It's a natural process that happens to everyone lucky enough to live a long life." The sun had begun its descent behind the mountains by the time they returned to Eleanor's home. The drive back had been filled with more comfortable conversation, with her children asking genuine questions about her work on the historical committee and her ongoing connections to the university. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts in her family's behavior. They were no longer watching her for signs of confusion or decline. Instead, they were engaging with her as they once had, as a person whose opinions and knowledge were valuable. After dinner, they gathered in the living room, the large picture windows framing a spectacular sunset that painted the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor settled into her favorite armchair, the one that had belonged to her husband James before his passing 8 years ago. "I'd like to show you something else," she said, reaching for a leather-bound album on the side table. "Something I think you need to see." The album contained photographs, not of family vacations or holidays, but of Eleanor over the past 5 years, receiving an honorary doctorate, leading historical tours, giving talks at academic conferences, volunteering with local school groups. Evidence of an active, engaged life that her children had somehow missed while focusing on isolated incidents of normal aging. When did you give a TED Talk? Michael asked incredulously, pointing to a photograph of Eleanor on a circular red carpet stage. 2 years ago, Eleanor replied. It was a TEDx event at the university. My talk was about the importance of preserving local history in the digital age. It has over 200,000 views online. Her children's expressions reflected their astonishment. How had they missed this? How had they failed to see the vibrancy that was so evident in these images? I think, Eleanor said gently, that you've been seeing what you expected to see. It's a common cognitive bias, we call it confirmation bias in academic circles. You noticed the milk in the pantry but missed the book manuscript I was editing on my desk. You remembered that I misplaced my keys once but forgot that I organize. The annual Historical Society fundraiser that raised $30,000 last year. Sophia looked up from the album, her eyes glistening. I feel like we don't really know you anymore, Mom. When did you become all this? She gestured to the photographs. I've always been all this, Eleanor replied with a small smile. I didn't stop being myself when your father died, or when I retired from full-time teaching, or when I turned 70. I simply continued evolving, as people do at every stage of life. That night, long after her family had gone to bed, Eleanor sat in her study, reflecting on the day's events. She was pleased with the shift in her children's perceptions but knew that one day wouldn't erase years of subconscious ageism. This would be an ongoing conversation, not a single lesson. She opened her laptop and found the presentation she had created about cognitive aging, adding new slides based on the day's experiences. This wasn't just about defending her own autonomy anymore, it was about creating a resource that might help others in similar situations. Perhaps something she could share with her colleagues at the university, or even develop into a community workshop. The next morning brought another shift in the family dynamic. Eleanor woke early, as was her habit, and found Sophia already in the kitchen making coffee. Couldn't sleep? Eleanor asked, accepting the cup her daughter offered. Sophia shook her head. I kept thinking about yesterday. About how we almost made a terrible mistake based on our own misconceptions. Eleanor nodded, appreciating her daughter's self-awareness. It's a common mistake. Our society tends to equate aging with decline, regardless of evidence to the contrary. But it's more than that, Sophia continued, her expression troubled. I realized that part of me was relieved when I thought you might be declining. Because it's easier to put you in a neat little box labeled elderly parent than to accept that you're still growing, still achieving, still creating a meaningful life on your own terms. Eleanor felt a rush of affection for her daughters. Honesty. That's a powerful insight, Sophia. And a brave one to acknowledge. I work in tech, Sophia said, her voice tinged with irony. We practically worship youth and innovation. I think I've internalized more ageism than I realized. Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. Awareness is the first step toward change. And you've always been good at changing course when needed, you get that from your father. The mention of James brought small smiles to both their faces. He had been adaptable and forward-thinking, traits that had made him an excellent partner for Eleanor's more analytical, structured approach to life. Michael and Diane joined them soon after, and the conversation continued over breakfast. For the first time, Eleanor felt her children were truly listening to her perspectives on aging, autonomy, and the importance of maintaining her connection to the community she had helped document and preserve. I've been thinking, Michael said as they finished their meal. Maybe instead of worrying about you so much, we should be learning from you. About how to age with purpose and engagement. Eleanor smiled. I would welcome that conversation. Aging is something we all do from the moment we're born. The question isn't whether we'll age, but how we'll approach it. The weekend continued with a different energy than it had begun. Instead of scrutinizing Eleanor for signs of decline, her family began to see her through fresh eyes, as someone with valuable wisdom not despite her age, but because of it. On Sunday morning, Eleanor suggested they visit the Cedar City Historical Society, where she volunteered regularly. The modest building housed an impressive collection of artifacts, documents, and photographs chronicling the region's development from pioneer settlement to modern community. Eleanor called Martha Johnson, the society's director, as they entered. I'm so glad you're here. We have a school group coming in this afternoon, and I was hoping you might lead the tour. The children always respond so well to your storytelling. Eleanor introduced her family to Martha, noting with satisfaction the impressed expressions on their faces as Martha detailed Eleanor's contributions to the society, from cataloging artifacts to securing grant funding for preservation projects. "Your mother is a treasure," Martha told Michael and Sophia. "I don't know what we'd do without her institutional memory and connections to the university. She's trained half our volunteer staff on proper archival techniques." As Martha continued singing Eleanor's praises, Eleanor stepped away to examine a new display case, giving her children space to absorb this additional evidence of her competence and community value. "Mom," Sophia said when they had a moment alone among the exhibits, "I feel like I owe you another apology. Not just for misjudging your cognitive abilities, but for failing to see the full dimension of your life. You've created something remarkable." Here, Eleanor considered her daughter's words carefully. "The apology is appreciated, but what I'd value more is a change in perspective. Not just about me, but about aging in general. About the assumptions we make when we see gray hair or wrinkled skin." The Historical Society visit expanded into an impromptu tour of Cedar City, with Eleanor serving as guide. She showed them the restoration project she had helped coordinate for the town's original schoolhouse, the community garden where she taught local children about heritage plants, and the university archives where she still conducted research for her occasional academic articles. By the time they returned home in the late afternoon, Eleanor could see that her children's understanding had shifted significantly. They were seeing her community, her contributions, and her capabilities with new clarity. That evening, as they sat on Eleanor's back patio watching the sunset paint the red rocks in spectacular hues, Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to talk about the assisted living brochures," he said, his tone apologetic. "We were wrong to approach it the way we did." Eleanor nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But," he added carefully, "I do think it's reasonable for us to have conversations about the future. Not because we think you're declining, but because planning ahead makes sense for everyone." "I agree completely," Eleanor said, surprising them. "In fact, I've already done quite a bit of planning. My lawyer has all the necessary documents, including my advance directives and power of attorney. I've researched several continuing care communities in the area, though I have no intention of moving anytime soon." She smiled at their surprised expressions. "Did you think I hadn't considered these issues? I taught American history for 42 years. If there's one thing I understand, it's the importance of looking ahead while learning from the past." Sophia leaned forward. "You've researched continuing care communities? Voluntarily?" "Of course," Eleanor replied. "I'm a researcher by profession and inclination. When the time comes that I need additional support, if that time comes, I want the decision to be on my terms, based on thorough investigation rather than emergency necessity." This revelation seemed to reassure her children more than anything else had. Eleanor understood why. It wasn't just about her cognitive abilities, but about her willingness to acknowledge the realities of aging while maintaining her autonomy. "I think," Diane said thoughtfully, "that what we really needed wasn't to make decisions for you, but to know that you're making informed decisions for yourself." "Exactly," Eleanor agreed. "And that's what I would have told you if you'd approached me with questions rather than conclusions." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Eleanor felt a sense of cautious optimism. The weekend hadn't gone as her children had planned, their intervention had become their education instead, but perhaps the outcome was better for everyone. The next morning brought their departure. As they loaded suitcases into their cars, the mood was markedly different from their arrival. The tension and worried glances had been replaced by genuine respect and, Eleanor hoped, a deeper understanding. "I've been thinking," Sophia said as she embraced her mother goodbye. "I'd like to come visit more often. Not to check up on you, but to learn from you. Maybe you could show me more about the archival work you're doing? It sounds fascinating." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. "I'd like that very much. And perhaps you could help me improve my website for the Historical Society. Technology changes so quickly these days." Michael hung back, clearly still processing the weekend's revelations. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he hugged Eleanor tightly. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "I think I've been so focused on making sure you were okay that I failed to see how extraordinary you still are." "Still are," Eleanor repeated, with gentle emphasis. "Not still, Michael. Just are. My worth doesn't exist in spite of my age, but alongside it." Michael nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I'll work on that perspective. I promise." As their cars disappeared down the winding driveway, Eleanor returned to her living room and settled into her favorite chair. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because she had successfully defended its status as her home, her sanctuary, her choice. She opened her laptop and began typing, capturing the events and revelations of the weekend while they were still fresh in her mind. This wasn't just personal journaling, it was the beginning of something larger. Perhaps an article for an academic journal on gerontology, or a series of community workshops on aging with agency, or even the foundation for her fourth book. Whatever form it took, Eleanor knew this experience had revealed a new purpose for her lifetime of accumulated knowledge. She had given her children a history lesson they wouldn't soon forget, not about the past, but about the present and future of aging with dignity, purpose, and autonomy. The red rocks outside her window glowed in the morning light, timeless sentinels that had witnessed countless human stories unfold against their backdrop. Eleanor's story was still being written, each day adding new chapters that defied simplistic narratives about aging and decline. She typed the working title at the top of her document, Beyond Decline, Reframing Aging as Continuous Growth. Below it, she added a subtitle, A Personal and Academic Perspective. Eleanor smiled as her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced ease. She had many more lessons to teach, many more contributions to make. And now, perhaps, she had more willing students in her own children, students who had learned that assuming memory loss in an older person might just earn them a history lesson they never expected. As Eleanor worked, the morning sun illuminated her silver hair like a crown, casting her shadow long and strong across the floor of the home she had no intention of leaving. Not yet. Not until she decided it was time. On her own terms, with her full faculties, continuing the lifelong process of growth that didn't end with retirement or birthday candles or the occasional misplaced set of keys. There were still chapters to write, both in her document and in her life. And Eleanor Hayes, Professor Emeritus, had every intention of making them count. 2 weeks after her family's intervention turned education, Eleanor sat in the office of Dr. Sarah Chen, her physician of 15 years. The relationship they had built over that time was one of mutual respect. Dr. Chen valued Eleanor's sharp mind and straightforward approach to her health, while Eleanor appreciated the doctor's willingness to treat her as a partner in her care rather than just a patient. Your blood pressure looks excellent, Dr. Chen said, reviewing Eleanor's chart. And your cholesterol numbers have actually improved since your last visit. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Eleanor smiled. Daily walks up to Pioneer Peak. The Mediterranean diet cookbook my colleague recommended, and the satisfaction of putting my children in their place when they suggested my memory was failing. Dr. Chen laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. At 55, she was nearly 2 decades younger than Eleanor, but they had developed a friendship that transcended the typical doctor-patient dynamic. Yes, you mentioned that on the phone. How did that all resolve? Eleanor recounted the weekend's events, the initial confrontation, her methodical dismantling of their assumptions, and the transformative moments when her children began to see her as she truly was. I turned their intervention into a master class on ageism, she concluded with a hint of pride. Though I suspect the lesson will need reinforcing from time to time. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. You know, what you experienced is remarkably common. I see it almost weekly in my practice, adult children jumping to conclusions about cognitive decline when their parents show normal signs of aging. The rush to pathologize aging is troubling, Eleanor agreed. Every forgotten name becomes evidence of dementia rather than simply a memory hiccup that happens to people of all ages. Exactly, Dr. Chen said, closing Eleanor's file. Which is why I'd like to propose something. The hospital is organizing a series of community health workshops, and I've been asked to lead one on healthy aging. I'd love for you to co-present with me. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you have in mind? A discussion about aging from both medical and personal perspectives. I can cover the physiological aspects and evidence-based recommendations, while you could address the psychological and social dimensions, how to maintain autonomy, combat ageism, advocate for yourself with family and healthcare providers. The proposal resonated with Eleanor immediately. It aligned perfectly with the article she had begun drafting after her family's visit, expanding its potential impact beyond academic circles to the broader community. I'd be delighted, she said, already mentally outlining potential talking points. When would this take place? We're looking at next month, at the community center. We're expecting about 50 attendees, primarily older adults and their family members. Eleanor smiled, thinking of the potential to reach families perhaps going through similar struggles. Count me in. I'll prepare something that might help other families avoid the confrontation mine needed to learn the same lessons. As Eleanor drove home from her appointment, she reflected on how quickly her perspective had shifted. What had begun as a defensive response to her children's misguided concerns had evolved into something more meaningful, an opportunity to address ageism on a broader scale. The road wound through the striking red rock formations that had been the backdrop of her life for decades. She had watched this landscape change subtly over the years, just as she had changed, not diminished, simply transformed by time and experience. When she arrived home, Eleanor found an email from Sophia, continuing their recent correspondence about the Historical Society's website redesign. Their relationship had shifted since the intervention weekend, becoming more collaborative and equal. Sophia had stopped treating her mother with protective condescension and started engaging with her as a fellow professional with valuable expertise. The email contained preliminary mock-ups for the website, along with a note: "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said regarding making historical archives more accessible to the public. These designs incorporate your suggestions about featuring oral histories more prominently. What do you think? P.S. I've booked flights to visit next month, not to check up on you, but to work with you on implementing these changes if you approve." Eleanor smiled at the postscript. Small steps, but meaningful ones. She began composing her reply, offering specific feedback on the designs while expressing her approval of the overall direction. This project had become a bridge between them. A way to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than hierarchical caregiving. Later that afternoon, Eleanor received a call from Martha Johnson at the Historical Society. "Eleanor, I've had the most interesting request," Martha began without preamble. "The State Department of Education contacted us. They're revising the Utah history curriculum for high schools, and they want our input on incorporating more local perspectives, particularly from long-established communities like Cedar City." Eleanor's interest was immediately piqued. "That sounds like an excellent initiative. What kind of input are they looking for?" "They want us to assemble a team of local historians to review their draft curriculum and suggest enhancements. Given your background in education and your extensive knowledge of regional history, I was hoping you would lead our team." The request was flattering, but more importantly, it represented another opportunity to ensure that the history Eleanor had spent decades preserving would be passed down to future generations. "I'd be honored," she replied. "When would they need our recommendations?" "They're working on a 6-month timeline, with the first meeting scheduled for next week. It would involve coordinating with 3 other historical societies in southern Utah and eventually presenting our findings to the curriculum committee in Salt Lake City." The project was substantial, exactly the kind of meaningful work that kept Eleanor's mind sharp and her days purposeful. "Please tell them I'm on board. I'll start putting together some initial thoughts and reach out to my contacts at the other historical societies." After hanging up, Eleanor felt a surge of energy. Between the health workshop with Dr. Chen and now this curriculum project, she had important work ahead, work that leveraged her lifetime of knowledge and experience rather than dismissing it as irrelevant due to her age. She spent the rest of the afternoon drafting emails to colleagues at neighboring historical societies, outlining the curriculum project and suggesting an initial meeting to coordinate their approach. Her academic training was evident in her methodical organization and clear communication, skills that had not diminished with retirement. By evening, Eleanor had received enthusiastic responses from most of her contacts, confirming her leadership role in the project. She prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a productive day. As she ate, she found herself reflecting on the irony of her current situation. Just 2 weeks ago, her children had been concerned that her memory was failing, that she was no longer capable of living independently. Now she was leading a state curriculum project, preparing to co-present a community health workshop, and collaborating with her tech-savvy daughter on a website redesign. The contrast was striking and validating. The next morning, Eleanor drove to Southern Utah University for a meeting with Professor David Whitaker, her former colleague who now chaired the history department. They had maintained a collegial friendship since her retirement, occasionally collaborating on research projects and community initiatives. "Eleanor," David greeted her warmly as she entered his office. "Always a pleasure to see you on campus. The students in my American West seminar are still talking about your guest lecture last month." "They were an engaged group," Eleanor replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Several of them emailed me with follow-up questions. Very promising scholars in that bunch." David nodded in agreement. "Which is partly why I wanted to meet with you today. The department has received a grant to establish a summer research program for undergraduates focused on regional history. We'd like you to serve as the program's advisor." Eleanor listened as David outlined the proposed program, a 10-week summer initiative that would pair students with local historical projects, providing them with hands-on research experience while contributing to community archives and exhibitions. "We're envisioning you as the bridge between academic methodology and practical application," David explained. "Your connections with the Historical Society and other community organizations would be invaluable for placing students in meaningful projects." The role appealed to Eleanor on multiple levels. It would allow her to mentor young historians, strengthen the connection between the university and the community, and ensure that important historical work continued through new generations. I'm interested, she said, particularly if we can align some of the student projects with the state curriculum initiative I've just agreed to lead. There could be valuable synergies there. David leaned forward, intrigued. You're working on the new state curriculum? That's excellent. Yes, I think we could definitely find ways to coordinate the efforts. They spent the next hour sketching out a framework for the summer program, identifying potential research areas and community partners. By the time they concluded their meeting, the initial structure was taking shape, with Eleanor playing a central role in bridging academic and community resources. As she walked across the university campus afterward, Eleanor felt a profound sense of purpose. The path before her was filled with meaningful work that honored her lifetime of accumulated knowledge while creating opportunities to share that knowledge with others. She paused by the university's central fountain, watching students hurry between classes. These young people viewed her as a resource, an expert, a guide, not as a declining elder to be managed. The contrast with her children's recent assumptions was stark and thought-provoking. That evening, Eleanor received a phone call from Michael. Unlike previous calls that had often felt like wellness checks, this conversation had a different tenor. From the start, "Mom," Michael began, "I've been doing some thinking since our visit. Actually, more than thinking, I've been doing some reading about ageism in healthcare and family dynamics." Eleanor settled into her favorite chair, pleasantly surprised by this development. "That's wonderful, Michael. What prompted this research?" "Well, after seeing how completely wrong we were about you, I started wondering if I've been making similar assumptions about my older patients. I'm a doctor, for heaven's sake. I should know better than to equate age with decline." As a cardiologist, Michael worked with many elderly patients. The thought that he might have been bringing unconscious biases to those interactions clearly troubled him. "It's insidious, isn't it?" Eleanor said gently. "These biases creep into our thinking even when we believe we're being objective. The important thing is that you're examining them now." "I've started making changes in my practice," Michael continued. "Simple things, like making sure I address my questions directly to my elderly patients rather than to the adult children who often accompany them. Making sure I discuss all treatment options, not just the most conservative ones." Eleanor felt a surge of pride in her son's self-awareness and willingness to change. Those small adjustments can make a significant difference in how older patients experience their care. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. The hospital where I practice is organizing a series of professional development sessions on bias in healthcare. When I mentioned our enlightening weekend with you, the education director was intrigued. She wondered if you might be willing to speak to our medical staff about ageism from a patient perspective." The request took Eleanor by surprise, but in the most welcome way. "I'd be delighted to, Michael. It would complement nicely with the community health workshop I'm co-presenting next month." "You're doing a health workshop?" Michael asked, his tone reflecting genuine interest rather than concern. Eleanor explained the collaboration with Dr. Chen, as well as her other recent commitments, the curriculum project, the summer research program, the Historical Society website redesign. "Mom, that's remarkable," Michael said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice. "Though I don't know why I'm surprised. You've always been more active than most people half your age." "Age is just one facet of identity, Michael. Not the defining characteristic that overrides all others." They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation flowing more naturally than it had in years. Michael shared updates about his children, his practice, his recent interest in medical history that had been sparked by their conversations about her work at the Historical Society. "I should let you go," he said eventually. "I know you're busy with all your projects. But I wanted you to know that our visit, it changed my perspective. Not just about you, but about aging in general." After they hung up, Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, savoring the evolution in their relationship. The intervention that had been intended to manage her perceived decline had instead catalyzed growth, not just for her, but for her children as well. The following week brought the first meeting of the curriculum review team at the Cedar City Historical Society. Eleanor had assembled a diverse group of historians, educators, and community elders from across southern Utah, each bringing unique perspectives on how local history should be represented in state educational standards. "Thank you all for agreeing to participate in this important project," Eleanor began, addressing the 12 people gathered around the conference table. "What we do here will shape how the next generation understands the complex history of our region." She outlined the project objectives and timeline, distributing copies of the current curriculum draft for their review. Her leadership style was confident and inclusive, drawing on decades of experience facilitating academic discussions while ensuring all voices were heard. "Before we dive into specific feedback," Eleanor continued, "I'd like us to establish some guiding principles for our recommendations. What values should inform how we present our regional history to young people? The discussion that followed was rich and nuanced, touching on issues of cultural representation, historical accuracy, and the importance of multiple perspectives. Eleanor guided the conversation skillfully, helping the group find consensus on key principles while acknowledging areas where diverse viewpoints should be preserved. By the end of the 3-hour meeting, they had established a solid framework for their curriculum recommendations and divided into subcommittees to focus on specific historical periods. Eleanor would coordinate the overall effort while focusing personally on the settlement era that had been her primary research interest. As the meeting concluded and participants began to disperse, Jennifer Blackhorse, a Paiute tribal historian who had joined the team, approached Eleanor. "Professor Hayes," she said warmly, "it's an honor to work with you on this project. I've admired your approach to regional history for many years, particularly your effort to include indigenous perspectives rather than treating native peoples as footnotes in the settler narrative." Eleanor smiled, genuinely touched by the recognition from a historian she greatly respected. "Thank you, Jennifer. That means a great deal coming from you. I've long believed that our regional history cannot be properly understood without centering the experiences of the Paiute, Ute, and Navajo peoples who were here long before European settlement. I have a proposal," Jennifer continued. "The Tribal Council has been discussing the creation of an oral history project to record the stories of our elders. Given your expertise in historical methodology and your connections at the university, we wondered if you might serve as an advisor to help us design a rigorous but culturally appropriate approach." The invitation represented a significant vote of confidence in Eleanor's abilities and cultural sensitivity. "I would be honored," she replied. "Though I would want to ensure that my role is supportive rather than directive. These are your community stories to preserve in ways that align with your values." Jennifer nodded in appreciation of Eleanor's understanding. "That's exactly the approach we're hoping for. Perhaps we could meet next week to discuss the initial framework?" They scheduled a preliminary discussion, adding yet another meaningful project to Eleanor's increasingly full calendar. As Eleanor drove home from the meeting, she reflected on how dramatically her professional life had expanded in the weeks since her children's failed intervention. Far from the declining elder they had imagined her to be, she was now engaged in multiple significant projects that leveraged her lifetime of knowledge and skills. The narrative of aging as inevitable decline had been thoroughly disproven by her lived experience. When she arrived home, Eleanor found a package on her porch, a delivery from Sophia. Inside was a new tablet computer with a note. "Mom, I thought this might be helpful for your website project and curriculum work. It's set up with all the apps you might need, and I've preloaded some historical research databases I thought you'd find useful. Call me if you need help getting started, but knowing you, you'll probably be teaching me new features by next week." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's note, appreciating both the thoughtful gift and the acknowledgement of her technological capabilities. Where once Sophia might have assumed her mother would be overwhelmed by new technology, she now recognized Eleanor's adaptability and learning capacity. That evening, as Eleanor familiarized herself with the new tablet, she received an email from Dr. Chen with a draft outline for their upcoming workshop on healthy aging. The proposed structure integrated medical information with social and psychological perspectives, culminating in a section titled "Advocating for Yourself, Eleanor Hayes on Maintaining Autonomy While Aging." The email concluded with a personal note. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the rush to pathologize normal aging. Your insights have prompted me to reconsider how I discuss certain age-related changes with my patients. Would you be willing to help me develop language that acknowledges the realities of aging without reinforcing negative stereotypes?" Eleanor replied immediately, expressing her enthusiasm for this additional collaboration. The opportunity to influence how a respected physician communicated with older patients represented another avenue for addressing ageism at a systemic level. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor reviewed her calendar for the coming weeks. It was filled with meetings, presentations, research sessions, and collaborative projects, a schedule that would be demanding for someone of any age, but one that she approached with energy and purpose. She thought about how differently her children now viewed her capabilities, how quickly their narrative of her decline had been replaced by recognition of her continued growth and contribution. The transformation in their perception was gratifying, but Eleanor knew that their initial assumptions reflected broader societal attitudes that wouldn't change overnight. Which was precisely why the work ahead, the curriculum project, the health workshop, the medical staff presentation, the tribal oral history initiative, mattered so deeply. Each represented an opportunity to challenge limiting narratives about aging, to demonstrate that later life could be a time of continued purpose, contribution, and growth. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor found herself recalling a favorite quote from historian Doris Kearns Goodwin: "We would do well to remember that history provides not only lessons of what to avoid but of what to embrace." The history lesson she had given her children was beginning to ripple outward, creating possibilities for broader change in how aging was perceived and experienced. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to extend that lesson further. Eleanor Hayes, Professor Emeritus, fell asleep with the satisfied smile of someone who knew their most important teaching was still underway. 1 month later, Eleanor stood at the podium in the Cedar City Community Center, surveying the audience that had gathered for the Healthy Aging Workshop. What had initially been expected to draw 50 attendees had blossomed into a standing-room-only event with over 200 people, a mix of older adults, family members, healthcare providers, and community leaders. The unexpected turnout had required a last-minute venue change from the hospital conference room to this larger space, a testament to the community's hunger for a different conversation about aging than the one they usually heard. "Good evening," Eleanor began, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Eleanor Hayes, Professor Emeritus of History at Southern Utah University, and I'm delighted to join Dr. Sarah Chen in welcoming you to tonight's workshop on healthy aging." She paused, taking in the diverse faces looking back at her. "I want to begin by asking a question. When you hear the word aging, what immediately comes to mind?" Eleanor invited audience members to call out their associations. The initial responses were predictable: decline, memory loss, dependency, illness. But as the exercise continued, other words emerged: wisdom, experience, perspective, freedom. "Interesting," Eleanor noted. "Notice how our collective associations contain both negative and positive elements. Yet our societal narratives about aging tend to emphasize the former while minimizing the latter. Tonight, Dr. Chen and I hope to offer a more balanced perspective, one that acknowledges the challenges of aging while celebrating its unique opportunities and advantages." Dr. Chen joined Eleanor at the podium, adding her medical expertise to the discussion. Together, they presented a comprehensive overview of the physical, cognitive, and social dimensions of aging. Dr. Chen covered the physiological aspects with clarity and nuance, distinguishing between normal age-related changes and pathological conditions, while Eleanor addressed the psychological and social components. When it came time for Eleanor to share her personal experience, she moved to the center of the stage, deliberately setting aside her notes. This part of her presentation needed to come from the heart. 3 months ago, she began, my adult children staged what they thought was a necessary intervention. They arrived at my home with assisted living brochures and concerned expressions. Convinced that my occasional forgetfulness, misplacing my keys, putting the milk in the pantry once, indicated cognitive decline requiring immediate action. Knowing laughter rippled through the audience, particularly from the older attendees who had likely experienced similar assumptions. What followed was what I now call the Great Reckoning, a weekend during which I systematically dismantled their misconceptions about my cognitive abilities and demonstrated that I was not only managing my life but thriving in it. Eleanor shared the story of her family's visit, the security camera incident, and the transformative moments when her children began to see her as she truly was. She was careful to frame the narrative not as criticism of her children, but as an illustration of how pervasive ageist assumptions could be, even among well-meaning family members. "My children aren't bad people," she explained. "They love me deeply. But they had unconsciously absorbed our society's narrative that aging equals inevitable decline. They noticed the milk in the pantry but missed the book manuscript I was editing. They remembered that I misplaced my keys once but forgot that I organized the annual Historical Society fundraiser." Eleanor moved across the stage, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. "This selective attention isn't unique to my family. It's a reflection of a broader societal bias that trains us to look for evidence of decline in older adults while overlooking evidence of continued growth, contribution, and capacity." She paused, allowing this insight to resonate before continuing. "But here's the important part of my story. Instead of simply being angry or hurt by their assumptions, I chose to turn the experience into an opportunity for education, for them, for myself, and now for our broader community." Eleanor detailed how the confrontation with her children had sparked a series of positive developments: her collaboration with Dr. Chen, her leadership of the state curriculum project, her advisory role with the Tribal Oral History Initiative, and her upcoming presentation to medical professionals about addressing ageism in healthcare. "What began as a defensive response to misguided concerns has evolved into a meaningful new chapter in my life's work," she explained. "I've discovered that challenging ageism isn't just about protecting my own autonomy, it's about creating new possibilities for how we all think about and experience aging." The audience listened with rapt attention as Eleanor shared practical strategies for maintaining autonomy while aging. documenting one's ongoing capabilities, creating advanced directives on one's own terms, building networks of peers rather than just depending on adult children, and directly addressing ageist assumptions when they arose. The goal isn't to deny the realities of aging, she concluded. It's to ensure that those realities are understood accurately, not through the distorting lens of stereotype and bias. It's to recognize that while aging brings certain losses, it also brings unique gains, perspective, wisdom, and the freedom that comes from knowing yourself deeply after decades of living. When Eleanor finished speaking, the applause was immediate and sustained. Dr. Chen returned to the podium, visibly moved by her colleague's presentation. This, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to Eleanor, is what healthy aging looks like. Not the absence of challenges, but the presence of purpose, connection, and continued growth. The Q&A session that followed was lively and engaged, with audience members sharing their own experiences of being underestimated due to age and asking for guidance on navigating family dynamics around independence and decision-making. One question in particular struck Eleanor deeply. An elegant woman in her early 80s asked, "How do you maintain your confidence when so many voices, including sometimes your own inner voice, are telling you that you're past your prime?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before responding. "I think it's about consciously choosing which voices you listen to. When my children questioned my competence, I could have internalized their doubts. Instead, I looked to the evidence of my own experience, my continuing professional contributions, my active community involvement, my ability to learn new skills and take on new challenges." She smiled at the woman who had asked the question. "I also find it helpful to connect with peers who are defying stereotypes about aging. When you see others in their 70s, 80s, and beyond living vibrant, purposeful lives, it becomes easier to envision that path for yourself." The workshop concluded with attendees breaking into small discussion groups to develop personal strategies for healthy aging and combating ageism in their own lives and families. Eleanor moved between the groups, offering insights and encouragement, noticing how people straightened when she approached, eager to share their thoughts with her. As the evening wound down, a local reporter approached Eleanor for an interview. "Professor Hayes, your presentation tonight struck a chord with many people. Why do you think there's such hunger for this conversation about reframing aging?" Eleanor considered the question. "I think we're experiencing a demographic reality that our cultural narratives haven't caught up with. People are living longer, healthier lives than ever before, creating decades of active living after traditional retirement age. But our societal images of aging still largely reflect outdated stereotypes from an era when life expectancy was much shorter." She gestured to the diverse audience still engaged in animated conversation. "What you're seeing here is people recognizing a disconnect between those stereotypes and their lived experience, or the experience of older adults they know and respect. They're ready for new narratives that better reflect the complex reality of modern aging." The reporter nodded, jotting notes. "And what would you say to older adults who feel invisible or marginalized because of their age?" "I would say that invisibility is not inevitable, it can be challenged and overcome," Eleanor replied. "When my children tried to make decisions for me based on their assumptions about my cognitive abilities, I didn't retreat. I confronted those assumptions directly with evidence of my continuing capabilities. That's a choice available to all of us, though it sometimes requires courage and persistence." She smiled, thinking of her own journey over the past few months. "I would also suggest finding ways to make your knowledge and contributions visible. Volunteer, mentor, join community organizations, share your expertise. It's harder to dismiss someone as a stereotypical, elderly person when they're actively contributing to causes and communities that matter." After the interview, as Eleanor gathered her materials, Dr. Chen approached with an excited expression. "Eleanor, that was remarkable. The hospital administrator was here tonight, and she's asked if we would consider developing this workshop into a regular series. She thinks it could become a model for other communities." The prospect of expanding their collaboration was appealing. "I'd be interested," Eleanor replied. "Especially if we could involve other older adults as presenters, showcasing diverse experiences of healthy aging." "Exactly what I was thinking," Dr. Chen agreed. "A panel format with different perspectives could be powerful. Let's discuss it over lunch next week?" As they confirmed plans, Eleanor noticed Michael and Diane standing near the back of the room. They had flown in specifically to attend the workshop, a gesture that touched Eleanor deeply. She waved them over, introducing them to Dr. Chen. "Your mother was extraordinary tonight," Dr. Chen told them. "The audience was completely engaged, and I've already received requests to make the recording available for those who couldn't attend." Michael nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering amazement at discovering new dimensions of his mother. "She's always been a gifted teacher," he said. I just didn't realize she was still actively teaching until recently. Still, Eleanor echoed with a pointed look that made Michael smile sheepishly. Just teaching, he corrected himself. No qualifier needed. It was a small linguistic adjustment that represented a significant shift in perspective, exactly the kind of change Eleanor had hoped the workshop might inspire. Later that evening, as they sat in Eleanor's living room discussing the event, Michael brought up something that had clearly been on his mind. Mom, when you were describing that A Great Reckoning weekend, you said something that really hit home for me. You talked about how we noticed the milk in the pantry but missed the book manuscript you were editing. That selective attention, looking for evidence of decline while overlooking evidence of capability, that's exactly what we did. Eleanor nodded, appreciating his self-awareness. It's a common cognitive bias. We tend to find what we're looking for. But that's what's changing for me, Michael continued. Since that weekend, I've been consciously looking for evidence of capability, resilience, and growth, not just in you, but in my older patients as well. And you know what? I'm finding it everywhere once I adjusted what I was looking for. Diane, who had been listening quietly, added her perspective. The workshop tonight made me think about my own parents differently. I've been worrying about my mom forgetting things occasionally, but I haven't been giving equal weight to how she's learned to use video calls to stay connected with her grandchildren or how she's become the treasurer of her gardening club. This was exactly the ripple effect Eleanor had hoped to create, changing not just how her own children viewed her aging, but how they approached aging in general. The next morning, Eleanor met with Jennifer Blackhorse to discuss the tribal oral history project. They had arranged to meet at Navajo Lake, a beautiful alpine lake surrounded by aspen groves that were just beginning to show hints of their autumn gold. This place has always been sacred to my people, Jennifer explained as they walked along the shoreline. The stories say that the lake was formed from the tears of a heartbroken maiden, and that the fish who live here carry messages between the worlds. Eleanor listened attentively, recognizing the privilege of hearing these cultural narratives directly from a tribal historian. It's a beautiful story, and one that should be preserved for future generations to understand the cultural significance of this landscape. Jennifer nodded. That's exactly why the Oral History Project is so important. Many of our elders who carry these stories are in their 80s and 90s now. Their knowledge is irreplaceable. They settled on a log overlooking the water, and Jennifer opened her laptop to share the initial framework for the oral history project that the Tribal Council had developed. The plan was thoughtful but needed refinement in terms of methodology and technical approach. These interviews will become primary historical sources, Eleanor noted. How they're conducted, recorded, and archived will determine their usefulness for future generations. We need to balance rigorous historical methodology with cultural sensitivity. Together, they began crafting guidelines for the interview process. Drawing on Eleanor's extensive experience with oral history projects and Jennifer's deep understanding of cultural protocols. By midday, they had developed a comprehensive approach that honored both academic standards and indigenous values. I think this could become a model for other tribal communities, Jennifer said as they reviewed their work. Would you be willing to help us create a training program for community members who will conduct the interviews? Absolutely, Eleanor agreed. And we might consider involving some of the undergraduate students from the summer research program I'm advising. It could be a meaningful learning experience for them while providing technical support for the project. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer shared a personal observation. You know, in our culture, elders are revered for their wisdom and knowledge. The idea that someone would question your competence because of your age would seem very strange. To us. Eleanor smiled. Perhaps mainstream American culture has something to learn from indigenous perspectives on aging. Absolutely, Jennifer agreed. Which is why I hope you'll consider participating in our tribal council meeting next month. We're discussing ways to strengthen intergenerational connections in our community, and I think your perspective would be valuable. The invitation represented another opportunity to extend Eleanor's advocacy beyond her immediate circle, to contribute to a community that already valued the wisdom of its older members. I would be honored, she replied. The following week brought the presentation to medical staff at Michael's Hospital in Salt Lake City. Eleanor found herself addressing a room of physicians, nurses, and medical administrators, many of whom, like her son, regularly made critical decisions about the care of elderly patients. I'm not here to criticize, Eleanor began, recognizing the challenging conditions under which healthcare providers worked. I'm here to share perspectives that might not be immediately visible from your side of the stethoscope. She described common experiences reported by older patients, being spoken about rather than to, having symptoms dismissed as just aging, finding their concerns minimized or overlooked, and being offered fewer treatment options than younger patients with similar conditions. These experiences aren't the result of malice, Eleanor clarified. They stem from unconscious biases that affect even the most well-intentioned providers. The good news is that once we become aware of these biases, we can take steps to counteract them. The presentation was not about assigning blame but offering practical strategies for more respectful and effective care of older patients. Eleanor suggested simple adjustments, making eye contact with elderly patients rather than just their accompanying family members, explaining medical options in full rather than making age-based assumptions about preferences, and recognizing the diversity among older adults rather than treating them as a homogeneous group. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many providers approaching Eleanor afterward to share their own reflections on how ageism had unconsciously influenced their practice. Several department heads requested copies of her presentation for use in staff training, and the hospital's education director invited her to develop a more extensive program for new physicians. As Eleanor drove back to Cedar City that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had expanded since that confrontational weekend with her children. What had begun as a defensive response to their misguided concerns had evolved into a multifaceted advocacy role that was creating ripples far beyond her immediate circle. The Cedar City Gazette featured an article about the Healthy Aging Workshop, highlighting Eleanor's perspective on combating ageism. The piece generated a flurry of speaking invitations from senior centers, retirement communities, and family service organizations throughout southern Utah. Eleanor accepted those that aligned with her message while politely declining others that seemed more focused on entertainment than education. Sophia arrived as planned to work on the Historical Society website redesign, bringing her technical expertise to complement Eleanor's content knowledge. Their collaboration had evolved into a true partnership, with each recognizing and respecting the other's areas of expertise. I've been thinking about how to make the oral histories more accessible, Sophia said as they worked side by side at Eleanor's dining room table. What if we created an interactive map that shows where each story took place? Users could click on locations to hear the associated narratives. Eleanor considered the suggestion. That would be an excellent way to highlight the connection between stories and place, especially for the indigenous oral histories we're collecting with Jennifer's project. The spatial dimension of those narratives is culturally significant. They continued developing the concept, with Sophia handling the technical implementation while Eleanor provided historical context and content guidance. Their working relationship had transformed from the condescension of the intervention weekend to a collegial exchange between equals. During a break, Sophia broached a more personal topic. Mom, I want you to know that the way you handled our misguided intervention has really changed how I think about aging. Not just for you, but for myself as well. Eleanor looked up from her notes, interested in her daughter's perspective. How so? I've been so focused on avoiding aging, the anti-aging creams, the fear of becoming irrelevant in tech as I get older, that I never considered there might be advantages to the later stages of life. Sophia smiled ruefully. You've shown me a different possibility, that aging can be a time of continued contribution, purpose, and even new beginnings. This was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the past few months, not just changing how her children viewed her aging, but how they envisioned their own future selves. Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. The secret that no one tells you, she said with a smile, is that inside this 73-year-old body, I still feel like me. My essential self hasn't changed, even as my exterior and circumstances have. That continuity of identity is something you'll discover for yourself as you age. As autumn deepened in the Utah mountains, Eleanor's calendar remained full with her various projects and presentations. The curriculum committee was making excellent progress, with their recommendations beginning to shape the state's approach to teaching regional history. The Tribal Oral History Project had secured grant funding with Eleanor's assistance, ensuring its sustainability beyond the initial phase. And most remarkably, Eleanor had begun drafting a book based on her experiences and the response to her presentations. Tentatively titled, Beyond Decline, Reclaiming the Narrative of Aging, the book would combine personal reflection, historical analysis of attitudes toward aging, and practical strategies for maintaining autonomy and purpose in later life. Her publisher, who had handled her previous academic works, was enthusiastic about this more accessible approach. This has potential to reach a much broader audience than your scholarly publications, her editor had noted. It addresses questions that millions of people are grappling with as our population ages. Writing had always been Eleanor's most natural form of expression, and this project allowed her to synthesize the insights she had gained through her recent experiences. Each morning, she devoted 2 hours to writing before turning to her other commitments, the manuscript growing steadily under her disciplined approach. One evening, as the first snow dusted the red rocks outside her window, Eleanor received a call from Rebecca, her eldest grandchild who was now in her second year of college. "Grandma," Rebecca began, her voice bright with excitement, "I just registered for my classes next semester, and guess what? I'm taking a course called Aging in America, Challenging the Narrative. Your book is on the reading list." Eleanor laughed in surprise. "My book isn't even published yet." "Not your history books," Rebecca clarified. "The professor is using the transcript of your Healthy Aging workshop presentation. It's been circulating online, apparently. The course examines how aging is portrayed in media and policy versus the lived experience of older adults." This unexpected academic application of her work was deeply gratifying. Eleanor had spent her career teaching others about history. Now her own experience was becoming an educational resource for understanding contemporary social issues. "Would you consider being a guest speaker?" Rebecca asked hopefully. "The professor nearly fell over when I mentioned you're my grandmother." "I'd be delighted," Eleanor replied, already thinking about how she might structure such a presentation for a younger audience. College students were still forming their perceptions of aging, their own and others. Offering them a more nuanced understanding could shape their attitudes and behaviors for decades to come. As the call ended, Eleanor stood by her window, watching the snow fall gently on the landscape she loved. The path that had brought her to this moment had been unexpected, beginning with a confrontation she hadn't sought but ultimately leading to opportunities she couldn't have imagined. What her children had intended as an intervention to manage her perceived decline had instead catalyzed a new chapter of growth, contribution, and purpose. Their well-meaning but misguided concerns had prompted her to articulate and demonstrate not just her continuing capabilities, but the unique value of the perspective she had gained through 7 decades of living. Eleanor smiled as she turned back to her desk, where the manuscript of her book awaited her attention. The working title glowed on her computer screen, "Beyond Decline, Reclaiming the Narrative of Aging." Below it, she had added a subtitle that captured the essence of her journey, "How One History Lesson Changed Everything." She sat down and began to write, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced ease, recording insights that would challenge perceptions, shift narratives, and perhaps help others navigate the complex terrain of aging with greater dignity and purpose. The lesson continued, extending far beyond her family, reaching into communities and institutions ready for a new understanding of what it meant to grow older in a world that too often equated age with irrelevance. It was the most important teaching of Eleanor's distinguished career, and she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.